think we will get started. The numbers of joiners have seemed to settle out. Good evening, everybody. I am Patricia Sesto. I'm the Director of Environmental Affairs for the town of Greenwich, and part of that responsibility, I work for the Conservation Commission. The Conservation Commission has undertaken this very important assessment as a project for the community. The impetus of the project stems from the fact that over the last 100 years, we have seen 8 inches of sea level rise. By 2050, we have projections that our area nation will be seeing another 20 inches of sea level rise, and that certainly is of consequence. And as we look further out to the end of this century, the projections start varying more considerably, anywhere from 3 to 8 feet of sea level rise cumulatively. So certainly this has implications for our community. Greenwich needs to understand these implications in order to respond properly and to facilitate resiliency within the community. When we consider that DPW has a planning horizon of 30 years, that brings us well into that 2050 planning horizon, and having an understanding of what is to come is totally essential. To have this understanding certainly requires a multidisciplinary assessment within the town hall departments, as well as bringing in outside consultants to better bring the expertise to bear on the community. Next. Next, Elisa. Okay. So to that end, we did just that, bringing in that interdisciplinary team. We have a series of consultants. We have our lead consultant, Princeton Hydro. They provide integrated ecological and engineering consulting services with a focus on creating resilient, sustainable, regenerative, and nature-based solutions. As indicated, Elisa is from BRS, as well as her colleague, Leah. BRS is an environmental planning and project management firm specializing in resiliency, community revitalization, and project funding with an emphasis on robust and equitable outreach. And I will say that BRS is taking the lead on pulling this program together tonight, and we are totally grateful for so much that you will be seeing this evening. And lastly, we have Ecopolitan Design. They combine landscape architecture with coastal adaptation and green infrastructure to study and adapt to the built environment in response to pressing sustainability challenges. So that is a fine team. And the departments who joined that team of consultants, we are represented by Parks and Recreation, Department of Public Works, Planning and Zoning, and of course the Conservation Department. Next. So our report components, we will have an introduction to sea level rise. We'll get a sense of sea level rise and Greenwich in particular. Work with the sea level risk assessment, landscape change, and through the landscape change, we looked at the town's 4 tidal ponds, being Bruce, Binney, Eagle, and Mill Pond, and to get a sense how these ponds are changing, where they are now. So that can give us an indicator of various environmental changes throughout our community. We have a risk assessment and then an evaluation of community vulnerability to sea level rise. Next. The assessment is scientifically based, and we will be using polls and question and answers from you this evening and our meeting next week, so that we can understand from you the points that resonate, the things that have a consequence to you, where your priorities might be going forward. And once these 2 presentations are done, those recommendations will be incorporated into the final report. So as I stated, this is a 2-night presentation on the topic at hand, with tonight being the first of those 2, dealing with basically a primer on sea level rise, so that all of us can be on the same page to understand the information that's going to be presented going forward. Tonight we will have a short video of Voices of Greenwich, and that will speak to what well-placed members of our staff have seen over decades in town, the changes and a snapshot of what one of our residents went through in rebuilding after Superstorm Sandy. We will get a better understanding of our ponds in transition, wrap this evening up with another poll, and then next week we get into the really good stuff. The second night will include the inundation mapping. This will give all of our participants a graphic representation of how the various levels of sea level rise will impact our community, as well as understanding the difference between sea level rise and storm surge as it impacts our lower lying areas. We will next week understand how this various scenarios impact our critical facilities, and then get some discussion going with regards to action. So again, we are looking for this to be an educational opportunity for you, and then for us to get feedback with regards to your primary concerns, and hopefully a growing understanding on both sides of how the community will be going forward. With that, I will turn it over to Elisa, who's going to summarize our poll.
I am hopefully sharing the results of the poll that many of you took. Thank you so much for participating. It looks like we have a lot of longtime residents and a really good showing from different neighborhoods. I know Old Greenwich, it looks like, is very well represented, as well as many other neighborhoods. And it looks like there has been a lot of disruption due to flooding in your community. So thank you so much for letting us know where you stand. And I'm gonna also give you another opportunity to tell us more later on throughout the presentation. I'm putting up another quick poll if you have a chance to answer this, and I am going to turn it over to Johnny, who from Princeton Hydro, who is going to talk to us about sea level rise. And yes, so sorry. So Johnny is a project manager at Princeton Hydro and a doctoral candidate at Rutgers University Graduate Program of Ecology and Evolution. His work and research approaches sea level rise from a multitude of perspectives, including equity, natural systems, and mitigation, as well as community-wide resiliency strategies. So I am gonna pass the torch over to Johnny and ask him to take us through his presentation about sea level rise.
Great, thank you. I want to start off by, once again, so my name is Johnny Quispe, and I'm happy to be here with you guys tonight to talk a little bit about our findings about the Greenwich Coastal Resiliency Assessment, but starting us off with sea level rise. So first off, before we discuss sea level rise, let's start with the basics. I'm sure you've all heard of a tide, but what is a tide? Tides are long periods of waves that move throughout the ocean in response to forces exerted by the moon and sun. Tides come from the oceans and move towards the coastlines, where they appear to us as the regular rise and fall of the sea surface. The highest part of the wave, when it reaches a particular location, is the high tide. And the low tide is the corresponding tide when the lowest part of the wave when the wave is at its lowest. And so here you should have a video playing. It is a time lapse of the Bay of Fundy, which shows a dramatic change in tide in the span of a day. So at the beginning of the video, you can see that the tide drops all the way down to the bottom, leaving some of the vessels touching the sediment. And when the tide comes in, all the vessels are now floating. This is a bit of a dramatic tide, but I really just want to show the influence that tides have not only on our natural systems, but also our built structures. And here we have a modeled rendering of the tide changing. This is off the coast of Australia. And this is one of the first LiDAR imaging renderings. So using satellites to really identify the low tides and the high tides and be able to identify some of the actual coastline here. So we see this change in tides, and they happen, as many of you may have noticed, twice a day in Greenwich. So Greenwich experiences, sorry about that. Greenwich experiences semi-diurnal tides. Similarly to the rest of the eastern United States, semi-diurnal tides means that there are two equally high tides and low tides every day. So as you see in this figure here, anything in red shows areas that experience similar tides as Greenwich. And Greenwich is right there, are starred. Now let's get a little into understanding tidal data. We've covered what a tide is, and some of the terminology that we'll be using throughout the presentations today and next week, including, and that's found along the report as well, are mean high water, which is essentially the average of all the high water heights observed over a period of time. And then we have mean higher high water. Mean higher high water is the average of the higher high water heights of each tidal day observed over a period of time. So this could be a little confusing. So if we're looking at a tide per se, over the span of a week or a month, throughout that period, we can identify the high tides. And within that period, within the high tides, we'll identify the higher high tides. And so that is a little distinguishing factor between the both. And we don't really mention mean lower water, mean low water, but that's the inverse of the high tide. So just think about high water, and then mean lower water is the low. So then we have in the center here, mean sea level. And so what mean sea level is that it is if you take the mean high water and the mean the height over and the mean low water height and the low over a period of time, we can identify what the mean sea level is. In this case, for our work, we use something called the National Tidal Datum Epoch, which is a tool used by NOAA. It's a method used by NOAA to identify mean sea level over a longer period of time. And that spans over 19 years. So they take the average height of the sea over this 19-year period, and the total amount, and that average is what they identify as the mean sea level. So studies have shown a rate of increase in sea level along the northeastern part of the United States. But what does this mean? We've seen here, we have a figure by Salinger et al. Back in 2012 that identified that sea level was rising at a more rapid rate along the mid-Atlantic than it was in anywhere else in the United States. And here we have I mentioned earlier, the National Tidal Datum Epoch. Here we have some data that's taken from Bridgeport, Connecticut. NOAA has a tidal gauge station there. And what you're seeing, what I kind of want you to pay attention to here is the linear relative sea level trend, which goes right between the center of the upper 95 and the lower 95 confidence interval. Essentially, since the mid-1960s, sea level along Bridgeport, Connecticut has been rising incrementally until today. So you can see that linear trend there as an increase. So again, what does this all mean, and how do these figures really impact us here in Greenwich? So before we get to that, there are a couple of drivers that cause sea level to rise. And the main three drivers are ocean warming, melting glaciers, and groundwater withdrawal and subsidence. And now I'll tell you a little bit about each. So ocean warming is, so the ocean absorbs more than 90% of the heat trapped by human-produced greenhouse gases. And here to the right, I have a little example of a Bunsen burner. So on the left side, we have a Bunsen burner under heat with a certain amount of water. As that Bunsen burner, as the heat turns up, the molecules within that cylinder, there, the graduated cylinder, begin to rapidly move in there. As it gets warmer, the water level tends to increase because the molecules are moving and interacting with each other, causing the water to take up more space. Similarly, in oceans at a much larger scale, this extra heat causes sea level to rise within the oceans. Now, I'm sure we've all heard about melting glaciers and how do those impact us? So mass loss from glaciers, ice caps, and ice sheets really can impact the rise in sea level. When glaciers melt, the runoff from their melting can significantly increase the amount of water the ocean has. And because glaciers are water that is stored on land, it's not water that is already in the ocean, that addition of water now increases the mean sea level. And so here, what you're seeing is a figure of a Muir Glacier in Alaska. The photo on the left is a photo taken in 1940, and the one on the right is in 2004. So you can see that big difference of ice loss, and that those melting glaciers, ice caps, and ice sheets all add to the rising sea level, which then increases coastal erosion, can elevate storm surge, and with the warming air and ocean temperatures can cause more frequent and intense coastal storms like hurricanes. The third main driver of sea level rise is the withdrawal of groundwater and subsidence, or the natural sinking and settling of Earth. Groundwater withdrawal results in fluid pressure change in the layers, so the Earth's layers, and the pressure change causes land compaction. So when we remove water from aquifers for private wells or commercially, all of that water is being taken out, and it creates these cavities, empty cavities underneath that over time can either collapse or gradually sink. And that causes us to just be that much closer to the sea level. So that causes us, that adds to the increase in sea level that we observe here on the page. So specifically, what are the impacts of sea level rise? As I mentioned, so first we have storms and flooding. So as sea level increases, storms and floods can happen more frequently with a higher intensity. And the water line from which flooding starts is higher. So think about where the tide is currently. So we covered the tides. If today's high tide is a little higher, let's say 20 years from now, the water is starting at a higher mark. Therefore, when a storm comes in, the water is a little more advanced inland and can now reach further inland than it would today. The other thing that would change are tides. So as sea level increases, the higher high tide is to be expected, and areas that were previously unaffected from flooding may experience sunny day flooding or partial flooding during high tides, which could cause issues for some homeowners, for pedestrians, for cars that are traveling through perhaps low-lying roads, and these are problematic. Coastline change. So as sea level increases, some lands could also become permanently inundated. As the sea level increases, you have water that's pushing inland, and in particular ecosystems such as wetlands or beaches or areas that are coastal and low-lying, they're being subject to something called coastal squeeze, where we have built structures and infrastructure on land, and you have sea level coming up. So the area in between is being squeezed from both sides because there's nowhere to go. So that coastline could change, and you may lose some of that coastline resulting in permanent loss of land and erosion as well. Then you have a saltwater intrusion. So saltwater intrusion may impact groundwater, aquifers, estuaries, and ponds, causing shifts in the whole in those ecosystems. So everything from vegetation, some vegetation can fare better in freshwater areas. But as sea level increases and you start having some of that salt water intrude, some of those plants might not be able to cope with salinity. So a lot of those freshwater plants may die and make space, and now this area becomes a habitat for brackish water or saltwater plants. So here we have some sea level rise scenarios. So these sea level rise scenarios that we're presenting and are used throughout the assessment are scenarios that are presented by CIRCA and are adopted by the Connecticut legislature. So these are built in, and this figure particularly is from 2019. And we used it as a foundation for our assessing of sea level rise for Greenwich. Now, from these scenarios, we selected we selected 4 years for scenarios. Now, and that results that change is inches from today. The second scenario is 2075, and that's about an increase in 30 inches of sea level. And then the last 2 are both for the year 2100. And however, the first one is a low. So this is assuming a low emission scenario, meaning that globally, we've done a really good job at reducing our global emissions of greenhouse gases, and we've kind of gotten globally we've gotten our act together. And so that projection says that there could possibly be an increase in 40 inches in sea level. The final scenario is 2100, which is the high emission scenario. That means, perhaps that greenhouse gas emissions are continuing as they are, and we have an increase in 80 inches. So this is, a little more on the high end. So one of the things that this assessment focuses on as well is the 10% and the 1% flood. So the 10% flood is identified as an event having 10% chance of occurring on any given year, meaning that there's a 10% chance of it happening this year. And if it does happen this year, that does not mean that 10% flood won't occur next year. And a 1% flood is defined as an event having 1% chance of occurring on any given year. So really important to know that this 10% and 1% floods both can occur on any year. And here's an example. So Ellicott City is a city in Maryland, which we may or may not have heard about, but we often refer to storm events in terms of the 100-year storm, or the 10% or 1% in this case. But Ellicott City has had 2 1,000-year storms in the span of 2 years. So just to put that in perspective, there is a 1% chance of a 1% storm happening on any given year. And for a 1,000-year flood, that is a 0.1% chance. So that has happened to them twice over the span of 2 years. Now, this is a massive flood that has really changed the landscape and changed the way that the city has reacted. But this is really just as a precaution to us as we think about floods, that just because there are 1% or a 10% or a 0.1% chance of these storms happening, it doesn't mean that it happening one year won't happen in the next year. it's important to keep that. So coastal high water events such as high tides and storm surges leading up to storms may impact stormwater and particularly stormwater systems. High tides and storm surges can drive backflow back into a system, causing flooding through street drains and drainage ditches. So backflow and the prolonged presence of salt water can then damage stormwater infrastructure, the piping, and any other mechanisms that exist, any other infrastructure that exists. Stormwater systems that depend on gravity to convey runoff could experience localized flooding when downstream parts of the system are partially or completely submerged by tidal flows. So that means if there's tidal flooding, flooding happening to a stormwater drain that's somewhere closer to the coastline, a part of that system that may be connected further away from the coast could still be impacted. And this could happen either through precipitation, so increased rainfall, coastal events such as coastal storms, or just really high tide or a king tide that causes these stormwater systems to flood. So in the end, more frequent, higher, and longer lasting high water events to really increase these impacts to the stormwater systems, can cause saturation of soil and really reduce the ability for the soils to absorb additional precipitation and any runoff that could happen following that storm. And now I guess I'll pass it up to Elisa.
Hello, so I'm back. I apologize that I did not share the flood zone poll questions earlier. So I will share those. And while you take a look at those, I want to thank Johnny for that really interesting assessment and drilling down into the details of what a lot of us have probably witnessed ourselves. So it looks like most of you don't live in a flood zone, but some of you do and some of you don't know. And I hope that yeah, so thank you. Sorry. We have another poll question that the question should be up on your screen, and I'm gonna post this poll. This is to see if you have seen an increase in flooding since you first moved here. Johnny just reported on the data, and so it would be interesting for us to know how that data matches up with your experience. And while you guys are answering this poll, what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna ask Patricia to introduce the next section, and then maybe afterwards, before the next poll, I will reveal these results. So Patricia, thanks.
Thank you, Lisa, and thank you, Johnny. That was excellent to set the stage so that we have our terminology and our understanding. There was one quick question of clarification. So a 10% storm is equivalent to what we used to call a 10-year storm, and 1% is what we used to call a 100-year storm. FEMA has rightfully moved away from that terminology because, as Johnny so clearly illustrated with Ellicott City, these things can happen back to back, even within the same year, and people were lulled into a sense of security that if a 100-year storm happened 30 years ago, we're cool, we have another 70 years to go. So now we got to turn that on its head and say every year you have a 1% chance of a storm of a particular magnitude, or 10% or 50%, depending on the size storm we are talking about. So thank you. Appreciate that, laying that groundwork for us. Sort of reflecting Elisa's last set of questions about have you seen changes since you've been here, we invited our DPW Director, Amy Siebert, Police Chief Jim Heavey, Department of Public Parks and Recreation Director Joe Siciliano, and then Michael Berry, a resident in Greenwich, to speak to us about their decades on the ground throughout the town, being responsible for us individually, the infrastructure of town, what they've seen, what their personnel have to deal with our various storms, what they hope you take away from them as emergency personnel or certainly people from around the community. And then from Michael Berry, a little tale of woe and success, I suppose, from recovering after Superstorm Sandy. I think we're ready to go.
I just wanted to post the sharing results really quick before I start the movie. It looks like there's a pretty even split of those of you who have seen an increase in flooding and those of you who aren't sure and haven't. So I guess more have seen an increase in flooding, but some of you haven't. So that's interesting to know. I'm going to stop sharing this and then I am going to switch screens. Sorry, just a second. I promise that I practiced this and it's not showing up. Just a second.
Hi, I'm Amy Siebert, Commissioner of Public Works.
Mm.
DPW takes care of the town's roadways and infrastructure associated with
See the
them.
video.
Hi, I'm Amy Siebert, Commissioner of Public Works.
So sorry, hold on a second.
DPW takes care of the town's roadways and infrastructure associated with them. So that's stormwater piping, bridges, traffic signals, signs, sidewalks, the waste transfer station, wastewater collection system, and its treatment plant, town buildings, and we have a very active building permit and inspections program.
It's not showing up. I'm sorry. Okay.
It was there and then it was gone.
Right, let's start it over.
Hi, I'm Amy Siebert, Commissioner of Public Works.
So sorry.
DPW takes care of the town's roadways and infrastructure associated with them. So that's stormwater piping, bridges, traffic signals, signs, sidewalks, the waste transfer station, wastewater collection system, and its treatment plant, town buildings, and we have a very active building permit and inspections program. Our work focuses on the operations and maintenance of all these systems and facilities, and our budgets are focused, of course, on keeping it all in good shape. So I've been with the department for 17 years, and I work with a lot of folks who've been here for many, many more years, several of them with over 30 years of service to the town. Over the years, we've seen an increasing need to address some of our facilities to meet the changes we're seeing in the environment. This has included the need to raise our structures in flood-prone areas much higher than anticipated in the past, where we can. Superstorm Sandy resulted in DPW modifying the design of 3 wastewater pump stations in the Old Greenwich area to elevate them further. Other facilities like the Grass Island Restroom Building have been elevated during replacement. We still have other town facilities to address over time, like the Grass Island Wastewater Treatment Plant, our Old Greenwich Highway shed on West End Avenue, our Newman Street facility on River Road, the Binney Park shed, and others. So we have a lot ahead of us with that. And we're also seeing impacts to drainage networks and our ability to manage stormwater in some areas. Higher tides and storm surges mean that stormwater cannot drain as effectively out to the sound, and there are limitations to what can be done about that. We've also seen in our newly rebuilt Meadow Pump Station that it became an island during a high tide that was not associated with the storm, and it resulted in surrounding the station with water. We are glad that our controls at that station are up at the second story level. Our highway staff have seen these changes in some lower lying areas where water reaches higher levels in catch basins and roadway areas, takes longer to recede, depending on the storm and the circumstances. And of course, with more frequent high intensity rainfall, when that happens with some of these higher tides, we can again see this kind of intermittent flooding. And until the tide goes out, water doesn't always have anywhere to go but our yards and our roads in some of those areas. And frankly, a lot of times there's not a lot we can do about that. So that's certainly a change. Our building inspection staff have even seen an increase in homes going up, being rebuilt at higher elevations, as well as seeing people put, systems like furnaces, hot water heaters, and the like up out of their basements or first floors up into attic spaces as these structures allow. So DPW is going to continue doing work to its facilities and systems in the face of all these challenges, ideally so that we can have infrastructure we can return to after a storm or a flood is over. We already have to move equipment and staff out when flooding is predicted. That is occurring somewhat more frequently as the years pass for us. And within our structures, having to elevate what we can, get it up into rafters or on a second floor if we have it. And as a result, we're going to have to all understand there are some situations that we can't fix. And where we can prepare ourselves so we have something to come back to after waters recede.
Hello, my name is Jim Heavey and I'm the Chief of Police for the town of Greenwich. I'd like to speak with you a little bit today about sea level rise and our storm response. We work with all the other town agencies in an all hazards approach to responding to these types of emergencies. Highway Department, Fire Department, GEMS, and other agencies in the town to have a plan to appropriately respond. I've been a police officer for over 35 years, and I've certainly experienced not just the named storms like Sandy, but others that affect us in the Northeast when there's a nor'easter or a hurricane that comes close to Greenwich. These can have a significant impact on homes and infrastructure near the coast. So we make an effort to be always monitoring and preparing for those storms. We will work with our emergency management director, open up our emergency operations center in advance of a storm so that we can coordinate our efforts. And for many of you who have lived in town some time now, we use all the modern tools like reverse 911 notifications, but we also use the old-fashioned going door to door, knocking on doors and putting a flyer in a mailbox to let people know that of an impending storm that may affect low-level areas of the town. And that type of response has happened much more often than it did when I first started out as a police officer. We have many, many miles of coast and many valuable properties, including boats, recreational boats, and the Marine Division of the Police Department is the primary emergency response agency on the water. We have 3 vessels, including one 39-foot public safety vessel that has firefighting, EMS, and police capabilities. One of the things that we always have to plan is that we're the last boat in, out of the water before this terrible storm, and then that way we're in line to be the first back in the water to respond appropriately to emergencies. One of the things that is a challenge for us is access. It's not something that I knew when I first started to be a police officer, but there's a slosh map, which is sea, lake, and overland surges for hurricanes map. And the town of Greenwich, although this is probably not easy for everyone to see, you can see the colored parts of this map are areas which could be affected during a hurricane. You can see the old Greenwich area, you can see all of the areas of Cascob, parts of central Greenwich, that all could be adversely affected when you have a storm and you have a high tide, those types of occurrences, and timing seems to make a serious effect on that. So for us, besides warning everyone to take the appropriate preparation, like making sure you have your flashlight, make sure you have fresh water, make sure you have your emergency food, we also have to consider the safety of our personnel and make sure that we have the best access possible. Unfortunately, during a couple of the significant storms over the last few years, we've had the challenge of getting to properties. There was a significant fire on Binney Lane a few years ago, and Sound Beach Avenue at Shore Road was completely covered in water, so you couldn't drive down there. We also had the occurrences of people who we warned and recommended that they evacuate due to storm conditions and then decided not to, and then called us and said, come get me. We, fortunately for that particular incident, we had National Guard assets. Our boats are larger boats. They draw a considerable level of water to be able to operate in them. Fortunately, the fire department has some smaller boats, but again, not easy thing to do during a storm when there's often electrical wires and other hazards that make it difficult to get to these low-lying areas. So the biggest, I guess, takeaway for us is that as a team effort with our residents, we need to make sure that people are prepared, make sure that they heed the warnings when they're out there, making sure that they pay attention to the town emergency messaging, and that in some cases that there might be things that they can do to their properties, especially along the shoreland, that could make it more difficult for adverse effects of weather. So again, when we see bad storms, it's not just one thing, not just the rising water level, but also electrical wires, disruption of communication, those type of things. So it only makes it harder for us in our response. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of oversight as to what we respond to, and we thank you for the opportunity.
Hi, my name is Joe Siciliano. I'm the Director of Parks and Recreation for the town of Greenwich. Let me tell you a little bit about myself. I've worked for the town for over 40 years. I've held various positions within the town. Originally, I was the Marine Operations Manager, and then I was the Superintendent of Marine and Facility Operations, and now I'm currently the Director of Parks and Recreation since 1999. I'm going to talk about a very important topic, which is flooding in our town, and demonstrate a couple of items that you would be interested in, and what the changes that I've seen over the tenure with the town of Greenwich. Interesting enough, some of our facilities, such as parks, work sheds, beaches, are all in some of the lower lying areas and been experiencing more frequent flooding over the last 40 years. A couple of things that of interest is that places like Binney Park, Bruce Park Shed, Grass Island Shed, all of our work locations, on occasion when we get storms or nor'easters and high tides, that we've had to evacuate those locations and move our equipment to higher ground. This is becoming a more frequent occurrence for us as a department. Another point of interest is at the corner of Bruce Park Avenue and Davis Avenue in Bruce Park. For many years, the town had what I would call an award-winning rose garden there. And over the period of my tenure here working for the town, the area of that corner, which is right there where the Davis Avenue bridge is, basically had become more critical and flooded more often. So much so that we could not maintain the rose garden. They were subjected to salt water infiltration, and eventually the rose garden came out. These are things that we've had in our town for a long time, and unfortunately, things like that we've treasured are now gone because we're seeing increasing flooding and increasing in storms. A couple examples, those are a couple examples. One of the things that I've seen in my tenure working for the town, I was also the water safety chairman for the American Red Cross for 10 years. I have a big waterfront background, a water safety background, and people should take this issue seriously. especially in low-lying neighborhoods where they tend to flood during storm conditions or hurricanes. And take the advice of the professionals such as the town staff and or the police, fire, when it's time to evacuate. This is a serious issue, and sometimes the life you save may be your own, in the sense those are to make a decision to leave the low-lying areas or to mitigate those low-lying areas during times of storm. It's important for us to talk about this. It's important for us as a town to plan for this, and it's an important for our future use of our waterfront property. So please take this issue seriously and join in and support this issue and support the report and the mitigation that may come in the future. Thank you.
Can you tell us what happened during Sandy and post-Sandy flooding events?
Yeah, so prior to, or about 24 hours before the Sandy hit, we were told to evacuate our neighborhood, and we did. Sandy, I think, hit our neighborhood at around 10 p.m. That was the peak. We weren't here, but we came back to the house in the area at about 7 o'clock in the morning, and it was clear that there'd been significant water damage. There was still a lot of standing water. The house wasn't underwater at that point, but you could see that there'd been about 6 or 7 inches in the first floor. So if you've ever seen a house that's had even a fairly small amount of water in it, it's devastating. It's the whole thing looks wrecked. It's incredible.
What was your thought process in deciding to rebuild or relocate?
Well, we loved the area so much that so we didn't think about relocating. And to be honest, we always knew that we lived in a flood zone, and that risk was ever present. We were surprised that how bad it was, but relocation wasn't something that we were seriously contemplating. But we did want to address the risk. Having gone through that once, was not wonderful, but it wasn't the end of the world. But contemplating doing it again, we didn't want to face that.
Michael, I know that you guys had to do a lot of thinking and planning in terms of lifting your house and where certain utilities were going to go. Can you explain what you had to go through in order to plan for possibly shifting some parts of your house around?
Yeah, it's a surprisingly complicated process. We thought it would be much more simple, but it's really moving the systems from, we had a crawl space, and then there was a sort of dedicated room on the first floor that had the boiler and the sort of the general systems like the electrics and all that kind of stuff. So to move that up into the attic space, that alone was quite a feat, rewiring, moving all the pipes, and then the physical lift itself. Chimneys are difficult to lift. So in our case, it was decided it was easier to actually get rid of the chimney altogether because it wasn't in great shape. And then the lifting process itself, prior to that, quite a lot of planning, architects, engineers. And so it was I think, at least a year process before even getting close to starting.
And how long has this process taken?
So the pandemic had an influence. So, it was bad timing. So that definitely played a role. The actual lift itself, from the time we were out to the time we were back in, probably about 7 months, I think, sort of 6 to 7 months. But a lot of that was pandemic related. Materials were short. The contractors were limited to what they could do. And I think there were times when 1 or 2 of them tested positive. So they all had to pause on the job.
Have you noticed increased flooding during rain events, and has that impacted your daily life?
We've certainly seen more standing water just driving around Greenwich, and in fact, not just Greenwich, up and down the coast. Definitely a noticeable increase.
What municipal parks or recreation facilities do you visit, and how often? And do you have you seen changes in the way that you're able to enjoy these facilities in terms of sea level rise and or flooding?
We often go down to Todd's Point, Binney Park, also in Greenwich itself, down by water. And yeah, we've seen an increase in water. High tides seem to be slightly higher, I would say. There's especially in Todd's Point, there's times when some of the access roads are covered with salt water. I think that was always the case on especially high tides, but they just seem to be slightly more often.
Okay, so I apologize for not mentioning this earlier, but I'm sure everyone has a lot of questions, and we will be answering all the questions at the end. So please be sure to post your questions in the Q&A, and whatever questions we might not get to, we'll get to next week. So I'm going to post another poll, and hopefully you should be seeing it on your screens. If you could just take a moment to answer that. And while you are working on that poll, I'm going to take this opportunity to introduce Dr. Fred Lubno. He heads up the aquatic programs at Princeton Hydro. Dr. Lubno has been an environmental consultant for over 28 years and has worked on a variety of ecosystems throughout the East Coast. Dr. Lubno is an expert in the field and will discuss the evaluation that Princeton Hydro performed on the 4 tidal ponds in Greenwich. I'm gonna quickly end the poll and share the results while Dr. Lubno begins his presentation. So let's see, here we go. So it looks like most of you believe that there should be either significant or incremental, but definitely investment in safeguarding facilities for the town. So thank you for providing that feedback. And Dr. Lubno, are you
Let me see
here?
Yeah, I think I'm there. Oh, yep, I am. Okay, thank you. And just heads up to everyone, I'm in southeastern PA and we're getting some thunderstorms right now. So hopefully nothing happens with the power. So I'll keep my fingers crossed for that. So yes, I'll be presenting some of the ecological and pollutant data that we collected on the 4 water bodies as part of this project. So this is some aerial views of some of the water bodies. So the first in your upper left is Eagle Pond. On your upper right is Bruce Pond. Your lower left is Mill Pond. And then Binney Park Pond is on your lower right. So I'll be going through each one of these. There we go. Okay. Whoops. There we go. Okay. Sure. Okay. And back. Okay. Whoop. I'll get the hang of this. So to give a little background, these waterways are classified by the state as SA, saline A waters, which means they provide a variety of aesthetic, ecological, and recreational services. The management is mostly passive, although we do know that Binney Park was dredged a few years ago. There's been some shoreline stabilization at Mill Pond. And these are coastal water bodies that are included in the Long Island TMDL. And the term TMDL stands for total maximum daily load. And it's a concept that was originally developed for point source wastewater discharge, which is why it says daily load. But we also use it for lakes and reservoirs and coastal ponds. And from that perspective, we look at it on an annual basis, even though it's still called TMDL. And essentially what that does is it identifies how much of a certain pollutant is going into a water body and what we need to reduce that by for acceptable water quality conditions. So I like to say a TMDL is almost like putting a water body on a diet for a specific pollutant. So that's a little bit of the background on these water bodies. The purpose of this evaluation was really to assess current water quality and ecological conditions of the 4 ponds. We wanted to provide an understanding of the potential changes to these ecological systems in regards to sea level rise, and also to identify potential future impacts and how we can begin to discuss concepts on mitigation or rehabilitation when it comes to dealing with sea level rise. So we did a variety of data collection. So we did some water quality monitoring, and the term in situ essentially means where we had meters and we collected data right when we were on site. Discrete involves the collection of samples that were then taken to a lab for analysis for nutrients such as nitrogen and phosphorus, or something called TSS, which stands for total suspended solids. It essentially measures the amount of dirt in the water. Plankton, which I'll be talking about. We also did some stormwater sampling. We sampled 2 stormwater events, including a tropical storm, and the baseline events. And when you hear the term baseline, it means we're collecting samples during a non-storm event. We did 2 in May and 2 in September. We also did some pollutant loading modeling and hydraulic modeling, so to quantify the movement of water and the movement of pollutants. And when it comes to lake and pond management, when we use the term pollutant, unless it's explicitly said otherwise, typically we're talking about the nutrients nitrogen and phosphorus, which stimulates algae and plant growth, and TSS, total suspended solids. We also did biological surveys in September, a week-long survey that involved fisheries, shellfish, benthic macroinvertebrates, which are the little bugs in the water, aquatic macrophytes, which include aquatic plants, seaweeds, macroalgae, and then some avian observations. So we collected a wide variety of data. Before I get into that data, I just wanted to give a little quick reminder about, so these systems are very estuarine. So they're, and what is an estuary? It's a body of water and or wetlands where you have fresh water, entering brackish or saline water. So it's this mixing that creates this very dynamic system. And keep in mind here, when we use the term freshwater, typically we're talking about that the salinity is less than 0.5 parts per thousand. When we use the term brackish, the salinity will be between 0.5 and 30 parts per thousand. And then if you think of a saline or a marine environment, we're talking something greater than 30 parts per thousand. These estuarine systems are extremely productive. They're some of the most productive ecosystems on the planet. This has a lot to do because there's a lot of available nutrients and carbon. And because of this, these estuary ecosystems have a lot of what we call valuable ecosystem services. So they provide a nursery for a variety of very important fish or shellfish. They're important for recreational and commercial reasons. They also help to sequester carbon. They also help to buffer shorelines against moderately sized storms and tidal influence. So there are ecosystem services associated with these estuarine systems. And they're inhabited by very specialized organisms that really have to deal with these wide changes in salinity, tidal changes, currents, and then you have the seasons on top of that. So it's not, say, if you think of a tropical rainforest, it's a highly productive system, but it's a fairly stable system when it comes to weather and season. The estuary is also a very productive system, but it's very dynamic in terms of seasonality, weather, and changing conditions. So I'm going to go through the 4 systems. Eagle Pond, which is probably the closest to a marine ecosystem. You can see very high salinity. It was greater than 25 parts per thousand. A variety of phytoplankton. So when you hear the term phytoplankton, that's essentially the free-floating algae in the water column. And what was interesting is we did see a variety of both marine and freshwater phytoplankton. There was one genus of a cyanobacteria called Oscillatoria, which it has the potential to create harmful algal blooms, but we did not see any at the time of monitoring. It was present, but it did not create any problems. The zooplankton primarily estuarine, and it was dominated by copepods. That group of zooplankton, very common in marine and estuarine systems, had some fairly high TSS concentrations, again, measuring the amount of dirt in the water. The hydrology of Eagle Pond is dominated by the tidal exchange. And this is essentially because there's no watershed when it comes to Eagle Pond. So it's this tidal exchange that will bring in nutrients and bring in solids. And then you'd have this resuspension of the solids as well due to currents and tides and the influence of the wind. So it's a very dynamic system, but essentially with no watershed bringing in nutrients from the land. It's entirely marine and aquatic based. So in addition to that, here's some information on the various components of the biological community for Eagle Pond, dominated by estuarine species like the moachogs, silver sides. There were some eel, some summer flounder, some northern puffer, and some bunkers. So there were some fairly marine fish in the community as well. A variety of invertebrates, some grass shrimp, snails, some clams, some polychaetes, oligochaetes. We saw some larger soft-shell clams and some rib mussels were identified. With plants, we saw widgeon grass, but we also saw a variety of marine green algae like ulva, sea lettuce, also green sea fingers, codium, and a variety of other estuarine plants and macroalgae. So a pretty healthy community that definitely leans more toward the marine type of system. If we move forward into Bruce Park Pond, now this was more of a brackish system, so it wasn't nearly close to marine the way the Eagle Pond was. The phytoplankton, mostly estuarine, but we had some freshwater species in there that were fairly dominant at certain times. For example, there was a diatom called Astronella that was quite common in the spring, and that can make the water look a little brown. We had some zooplankton that included copepods, but we also saw some freshwater groups, such as rotifers in Bruce Park Pond. Some really high TSS concentrations. The hydrology was still dominated by tidal exchange, but we did see that since there's a watershed for this pond, and just to put it in context, if you think of the pond as the bottom of a funnel, the watershed is the funnel itself. So any rain that hits that funnel and eventually goes to the bottom of the funnel, that's the watershed. And we did see some fairly high nitrogen loading, some high phosphorus as well, some elevated bacteria coming from the watershed, rinsing into this system. And that would result in these wide swings in salinity, where we go from essentially a brackish system to, after a large storm event, it could be close to fresh water because of all the water coming in from the watershed. Again, similar, that it was dominated by estuarine species, the killifish, the silver sides. We did see some eel, some summer flounder, some northern puffer. So a very similar fishery. And then when you look at the invertebrates, we saw more of the burrowing forms of polychaetes. We saw some scuds, some midges. The midges they prefer more of the freshwater systems. We saw no live shellfish. We did find some older oyster shells. And again, remember, this is a system that can fluctuate from freshwater to marine pretty quickly. We did see a variety of both widgeon grass, some ulva, sea lettuce, but then we also saw some aquatic plants that are more common in freshwater systems, like duckweed and like curly leaf pondweed. So again, more of an estuarine system, more of a complex of both freshwater and marine species in Bruce Park Pond. So for Mill Pond, we also saw high salinity, but again, we would see it, that salinity decline fairly quickly after these large storm events. The phytoplankton, again, we found a variety of algae. We found one cyanobacteria, oscillatoria, but it did not attain densities where you would say it's generating a harmful algal bloom. The zooplankton were primarily estuarine, some fairly high TSS concentrations, and again, some high nutrient concentrations associated with these storm events. So, all these nutrients go in, they help to stimulate all this algae and plant growth, It really allows all of the macroinvertebrates and a lot of the filter feeders to feed on these organisms. It's a very productive system. And again, we're dealing with a system that is not suffering, but experiencing these wide changes in salinity. And so if we look at the ecological communities for Mill Pond, a very high fish density. Actually, I think Mill Pond had the highest both diversity and number of fish caught during our surveys. And, you know, to be perfectly fair, a lot of that probably had to do that Mill Pond had a harder bottom, so it was easier to sample. That may have been part of it, but a very productive system, some striped killifish, silver size, some sheephead minnow. And what was really interesting is an oyster toadfish, which I'll show you a photo of in just a second, and then some eel as well. For the invertebrates, we found some seed shrimp, some mud snails, again, some midges, some grass shrimp. So again, a variety of invertebrates that you can find in, you know, marine and freshwater systems. We did find some hard clams and some rib mussels. And again, the plants, we were seeing, you know, again, the ulva, but we were seeing some fragments of coontail, which tends to be a freshwater aquatic plant, some Spartina and some Phragmites along the shore. And again, that helps to stabilize the near shore areas. And just to show you, this was probably one of the more interesting species we caught, this oyster toadfish. This is a species we weren't expecting to find in the survey. So a lot of photos were taken of that particular species in Mill Pond. So that's what we found there. And then to go to Binney Park Pond, again, salinity varying not only based on storm events, but also with depth. So the more saline waters at the bottom, again, that saline water would be denser. When you look at the phytoplankton, what was interesting is we did find a moderate bloom in September of a specific type of diatom called Aerococcus, and it's responsible for brown tide. Now, it can be a harmful algal bloom, but it doesn't have the potential health impacts that cyanobacteria have. But what it can do is when it blooms, when it crashes, it can use up all the dissolved oxygen, and that can potentially cause a fish kill. But also, this particular diatom produces some compounds that can inhibit filter feeding for a lot of organisms. So it's not considered the best organism to have there. So in that one September event, we did find some Aerococcus, that particular diatom. The zooplankton, again, it was a mix of copepods, which are very common in marine and freshwater systems. And then we were seeing things like rotifers and cladocerans, which tend to be more common in freshwater systems. During the storm events, again, high nutrient concentrations, high TSS concentrations, not surprising. But let me get to the next one. What we did find surprising, again, we have a lot of nutrients going into this system, but the fishery was fairly poor at Binney Pond. And there can be a number of reasons for that. One is of the 3 ponds that we saw these swings in salinity, Binney Pond had the largest swings in terms of percent changes, number one. Number two, you know, that brown tide organism, that diatom may be contributing toward that. And then the other is, since it has been recently dredged, it may be taking a little time for the community to come back and stabilize. So there are a number of factors that may explain why there was a poor fishery in Binney Pond. We did catch some killifish. We did find some bluegill, largemouth bass. And again, this is the pond that had the largest swings in terms of freshwater to marine. Very poor benthos, you know, a lack of burrowing organisms. We found some grass shrimp, and that was about it. No live shellfish. We did see some barnacles on the side, some dense filamentous algae growth in September, and then some sea lettuce, which is a green marine algae as well. And to bring this home in perspective, we've lined up the fishery survey data for the 4 ponds. And if you look at it, you can see Mill Pond by far the most diverse and the highest number of species and fish caught, relative to Binney Park Pond, which had the lowest number of caught and the lowest diversity. I will say too that Eagle Pond, more of closer to a marine system than the other three. So in summary, all the ponds are brackish. And then salinity generally correlates with distance from the estuary. Eagle is near saline, where Binney has a limited freshwater habitat. The biota is estuarine, occasional forays into freshwater organisms. All of the ponds are very eutrophic, which means there's a lot of nutrients in there. And again, in an estuarine system, that is common. You're not expecting these systems to look like Lake Tahoe or the Caribbean. They have a lot of nutrients associated with them. Sorry about that. I didn't do that. All right. Binney is very impaired in regarding to water quality, biota, sedimentation, but the communities are robust. We have a variety of organisms that are adapted to these variable salinities and are used to dealing with these high nutrient, high sedimentation rates. And the last thing I want to say is Eagle Pond can be considered sort of as maybe the future of the other ponds relative to sea level rise, that if we see additional increases in sea level rise as we're seeing, as that continues to rise, these other water bodies may become more and more saline and may reflect a community similar to what you see in Eagle Pond. So thank you for your time. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lubno. I just put up a new poll that you should be coming up on your screen. And while you're responding to that poll, I'm going to ask Patricia to give us a quick preview of next week, and then we'll go into the Q&A.
Thank you. You've stopped my video and I need permission to come back.
Oh no, okay.
Oh no.
You can always come back. Let's see.
Thank you. I'm back. All righty. Yeah, thank you, Fred. That was terrific information. We think of the ponds as this sort of static element in our landscape, except for tides maybe coming and going. I'll say perhaps, no, with the exception of the Eagle Pond and Mill, you don't really, when we pass by Benny and Bruce, we don't really even realize that they are tidally driven, and to the extent they are. So thank you for that information. I think it certainly helps us understand our changing landscape, and we can extrapolate from there throughout town. So thank you, coastal town. Tonight has been a terrific opportunity to get us all on the same page with information to set the stage for next week. We are going to be looking at, this is going to be the good stuff. This is where, not that the other stuff wasn't good, but this will be the part where people are going to be leaning in and going, where's my neighborhood? And really taking a look at how not just inundation mapping as it affects the town as a whole, but then I suspect there'll be many of us who will look and see how it might be impacting us directly. So the inundation mapping, we're going to go through how those maps were created, what they mean, the various storm scenarios that Johnny described earlier this evening. And then we're going to take that information and relate it to specific facilities of town. We heard from Amy how DPW has already taken the cue from what they have seen going on in the community, started raising the sewage treatment facilities so we can keep that critical piece of infrastructure operating. But we have many other pieces of infrastructure that we need to worry about: storm drainage, our fire stations, schools, roads. All of these things matter during storms. And as we move into higher inundation levels, we're going to see more nuisance flooding, and we need to understand how that's going to impact our ability to protect and serve our town. So that is what next week holds in big measure. And then we'll also talk about actions, some things that can be done, what sort of concepts can't be done. We can't raise all the roads. We can't put up a great big seawall across us. So what can we do conceptually? And I hope that that generates then questions and concerns of people, because this is really the part that's going to help guide us and the town going forward. And as the poll showed, I think last I saw the poll, 100% of participants said, yep, town needs to be spending some more money on this as we move through subsequent budget seasons. And that's important. The town is always in a squeeze. There's always lots of things to be done, and finding the resources to pay for them can be a challenge, but understanding that at least 40 people in town think that this is worth our attention financially, as well as in a planning segment. We'll also next week discuss a bit about our planning and zoning regulations. I think that was one of the questions in the chat box. Part of this assessment included an assessment of our current building zone regulations, where they can be strengthened in order to be responsive to what's coming and the implications of that. As well, the assessment looked at inundation of seawater and how it might affect the neighborhoods that have septics along the shoreline. Another piece that is essential to keep working. So with that, I'm going to throw it back to, I think Leah is going to do our Q&A. We've got questions in the Q&A. Please keep them coming. We've got people, in addition to the ones that you heard speaking tonight, we've got other members of the team here, and happy to address the questions that you've posed to us. Thank you. Leah?
Thank you so much, Patricia. And thank you very much to all of our speakers. My name is Leah Yasenchuk. I'm a principal at BRS and on the Princeton Hydro consultant team. And so first, I'm not sure if you can see the results of the poll, Elise. I'm not sure if that's up for everybody, but it looks like almost everybody that responded felt like they learned something new. And we did get a lot of questions in the chat. So we are going to go through as many of those as we can. And those that we don't get to, we will bump to next week and hopefully be able to address them there as well. So keep them coming. And also, even if you don't have a question, but you have a comment and something that you want to share, as was mentioned previously, please add that to the Q&A. We're going to be collecting all of that, and all of your input will be provided to the town officials, as well as integrated into the recommendations that we make in the final report. So let's see. I want to try and get to as many questions as we can. To kick it off, the first question, I'm going to hit over to Fred and Elisa. Can we go into panel mode maybe, so that people can see everybody? Great. So Fred, how do we use this information to best manage the ponds?
Well, first off, there has to be a discussion of what the ponds, or what the ponds will be used for. And when I say used for, I don't necessarily just mean recreational, but from an ecological perspective. So if we are thinking of these as productive estuarine systems that over time may be accumulating material and creating wetland habitat, I mean, there's benefit to that. Do we want that? And the information we have provides really good insight into what organisms we already have. So knowing that Eagle is more of a marine system, and a lot of that has to do with it not having a watershed, really tells us that that can be managed more as a marine system. And so you may not need to do as much of more proactive stuff with the other water bodies if you want those water bodies functioning as, say, a quote lake, or if you want those water bodies to function as a wetland or an estuarine wetland. Because again, like I said, each one of these has a set of ecosystem services that aren't just important for aesthetics and recreation, but they're also important for the ecological value of those systems. So that's something that, using this information, we can then go and say whether or not something needs to be done to address a specific situation. You know, I mentioned how in Binney Park, the quality was low. Well, it would be interesting to do another fishery survey 2-3 years from now. Is there an improvement? And is that in fact a function of the recent dredging? Or is there some other issue going on in there? Why the quality of that fishery isn't as high as it was in the other lakes? So there's a variety of ways you can use this data.
Great, thank you. We also got a couple of questions about dredging. Would dredging the ponds be able to maintain them as open waters and provide some more storage to reduce flooding?
Yeah, see, the thing about dredging is it does very little to deal with flooding issues, particularly in such dynamic systems, because with any, whether it's a freshwater lake or an estuarine system, there's a level of maintenance dredging and non-maintenance dredging. The maintenance dredging is if you decide for a specific water body, you want it to be a lake or a pond, then you may need to set aside funds to identify that every 20 years, every 30 years, every 50 years, we will be dredging this system out. That's something that, as a community, you have to decide. And if that's what we want, that's what we have to plan for. Unfortunately, these systems are so dynamic. And as we saw along the coast of New Jersey with a lot of our shore lakes, when Hurricane Sandy hit, a lot of those lakes were completely filled in with sediment, with debris, and a lot of communities had to make a lot of hard choices whether or not they wanted to rehabilitate those lakes. And that's the other thing with climate change. Not only do you have the sea level rise, you have these extreme weather events. I mean, Johnny went over those great examples of Endicott and the one I'm familiar with a class I teach is down in Austin, Texas, talking about the impacts of Harvey, Hurricane Harvey. So those are sort of the unexpected things that can happen, and whether or not you're going to decide to dredge. Dredging is not the cure-all, particularly for these very dynamic systems. But if you do want some open water, you have to decide as a community, do we want to dredge? And if so, you would need to start collecting some bathymetric data, some rates of sedimentation. And even with that, like I said, an extreme weather event can come in and just completely throw your trend out of the water. But you have to have some sort of data like that and then decide as a community if you want it as an open water.
Great, thank you. Amy, we got a question about what could be done to control the overflow of Mill Pond. Is that something that you're able to address?
I can take a little stab. I'm not sure if someone's referring to keeping a certain level in the ponds, or if there's a worry about what happens when we have riverine flooding or we have super high tides. But we certainly have a control structure at the end of the ponds that controls it. But I think everybody's probably already seen that structure, under certain tidal conditions, obviously the ponds fill in more. Trying to hold back the ocean can be a very difficult task, as I think everyone here has already explained in the presentation. So, but I'm not sure if that gets it exactly at what anyone's looking for, but we can certainly take it up with them. And then if they're willing to come next week too, or reach out to us and let us know specifically what their worries are.
Great, terrific. Christiana, you haven't been introduced yet, but Christiana is an ecologist with Princeton Hydro, and she's the project manager for this whole assessment project. I'm wondering, Christiana, we did get a question about floodgates at a particular bridge, River Road Bridge. Is that something that would be effective in controlling flooding?
All right. Thank you, Leah. So floodgates can be effective when in the appropriate landscape. So typically we see these on larger rivers when it's difficult to manage the flooding. But like I said, it does impact, it depends on that appropriate landscape. So if you have surrounding ground elevations that are low lying, whether you have a tide gate or not, the water tends to flank or bypass the tide gate, and then overland surge will create flooding. So it's really important you to do a detailed study as you understand, where floodgates need to be placed. You also have other considerations with decreased tidal flushing as well. And something we talk about during storm events is sort of the bathtub effect. So if you have a floodgate and you're closing the river from draining into the bay or into the sound, you've actually exacerbated your flooding upstream because that water has nowhere to be conveyed to or flow to. So they can, like I said, they can be effective, but it's very dependent on the appropriate landscape.
Great, thank you. Well, you have your mute off. Let me ask you another question as the project manager. We've talked a lot about the current shoreline conditions, and are you going to be looking at the assessment conclusions and recommendations in the analysis in terms of is this current, if I'm understanding this question correctly, are you going to be including the current conditions in with the recommendations in the report? And how's that going to be addressed?
Yeah, absolutely, we will be. We're taking a holistic approach. So we're evaluating, sea level rise, 10% flood event, as well as the 1%, both in current day settings, as well as in those future planning horizons that Johnny had discussed earlier. And then with everyone's input during this meeting as well, we're going to assess the direction that the residents would like to see the town take, as well as what the town wants to consider. So we're really taking that holistic approach and considering all aspects to create a scientifically supported planning.
Great, thank you. Fred, you didn't say anything about turtles. Are there turtles in the ponds?
So my understanding was, I didn't do any of the sampling, but I did talk to the field team and I did go through some photos. Jesse said he did see a few turtles. I saw no photos, but he did see a few in, not Benny, but Bruce. He said he saw a few turtles. None in Eagle or none in the others, but that's the only, and again, it was an observation. They weren't like found in our nets or anything.
For that. Patricia?
I'll jump in with Benny definitely has turtles. When we did the dredging, it was lots of fun. The dredging crew had to learn how to handle snapping turtles to move them out of the way of the dredgers. So that was fun picking those little.
Yeah, I've had to do that. That's a lot of fun. Yeah,
that's a lot of fun. And we recently had a high school student build a turtle island for Benny, which is being very well used. Build it and they will come. So that aspect of Benny is thankfully seems to be rebounding, perhaps a little faster than fish.
Terrific. We do still have a couple more questions, but we're reaching the end of our time. It is 8:30. So with that, I want to kind of end the formal presentation, but all of the panelists will stay on for another few minutes. If folks are interested, we'll try and answer a few more questions and maybe can have a little more informal discussion. And Pat, did you want to say a few words before we kind of officially close it out about the next week's meeting?
Yes, thank you. So part 2 next week, Wednesday, likewise starting at 7 o'clock. If you've lost the connection of how to get in, the easiest way to find your way back to us next Wednesday is on the town's website. It is the first banner of a series of banners, and you've got instructions there to click, and you're in. The town has done a fabulous job of making it super easy for participants. If you're interested in next week but are not able to attend, it will also be recorded and will be put up on the website. So you can come back and have a look at that. And the report will also, once finalized, be on the website. And then we have this fabulous storyboard that speaks to the issues that we've discussed tonight, and next week in a really neat way breaks down the pieces that you can find your way. So if you're excited about this, you want to see more, that's great. We'll have that up after our second presentation. And let other people know that it's there too. And please spread the word for next week. More the merrier. Happy to have you. So Leah, back to you. Any questions to finish up?
Yeah, great, thanks. So if like I said, we'll have kind of a less formal for the next 15 minutes or so, and then the Zoom will cut out at 8:45. But if anybody wanted to, I believe if you raise your hand, we can unmute you, and then you'd be able to ask your question directly, or I will continue to go through the questions now, you know, until I see some folks wanting to be unmuted. So we did talk about the health of the ponds and the dredging. Fred, maybe you're the best to answer this. Did the prior dredging at Binney improve the health of the pond?
Yeah, unfortunately, we don't have any pre-dredging data, which would be extremely valuable. I mean, we do that very frequently, where we'll collect data before, not only sediment thickness, but also plant distribution, and then afterwards. And so it's really difficult to say whether or not dredging had that sort of effect. Now, based on some of our other projects in more estuarine systems, after a dredging or a movement of sediment, the organisms come back pretty quickly. In my understanding, the dredging happened maybe 3 years ago. So, I mean, you know, if the dredging had some sort of impact, my gut feeling is, based on other similar projects, that the organisms would have come back. There might be something else going on. I mean, the idea of turtles, maybe there's a nice turtle colony there, and those turtles, especially snappers, are helping to keep the fish population down. I'm not quite sure, but I can't definitively say whether or not the dredging is the reason why we're seeing that lower community in Binney.
Great, thank you. Yeah, we'll have to, maybe that's something for the town to keep in mind the next time a dredging is planned, to get some pre-dredging data. I think we have one hand raised. Elisa, are you able to unmute the participant?
So Peter, Alexander, are you still here?
Yes.
Oh, wonderful. We can hear you.
Oh, and you look like you're in Egypt.
Yeah, that's there was such a quick 20-year global cooling. That's why the Nile River became saline, and the pyramids and the million population had to move up to Luxor because of a sudden global cooling. But on a different note, Long Island Sound, it's kind of unusual because it's still an estuary. It's east-west orientation, and the same amount of water comes in through two areas, the Block Island area and the East River in front of the UN, pretty much. But for 10,000 years, it's been getting shallower, including today. And I think that we should carefully look at the possibility of using some of the filled in areas to recreate the salt marshes that were here. I think it would be a better use of what is increasing the tidal action at the high level, including during storms. So
okay, great. So we'll yeah, we're collecting all of this input that we're receiving through the Q&A, and we'll add that to the consideration for the recommendations. We only have a few more minutes before we're going to get cut off, so let me throw this one out there. Amy, I think this might be for you. What town department is responsible for cleaning floating debris from the ponds?
So I would expect that it would be the Parks Department. These ponds are in town parks. Now, having said that, I mean, that's Binney and Bruce. When you look at Mill Pond, it's not a necessarily a highly managed area or a manicured area like a park. And it's natural for these materials to, appear and do their thing, right? As we've all seen that as things come downstream in rivers and move around. But I think that the Parks Department does its best to try to clear things. We try to clear things away from storm drains, or, if we have a structure that we manage. But it is kind of and Pat, I don't know if you want to throw anything in there about, it's nature does this to us. It drops things into rivers and streams and ponds, and but then some of that, right, we find ourselves explaining to people that it creates habitat too sometimes. So Fred can speak to that. So many little wrinkles there, but in terms of probably main aesthetics, or something big or large in the parks department steps up and helps deal with these things.
Okay, terrific. Let me answer just two quick kind of housekeeping questions. There will be a recording of tonight's meeting posted on the website. And we did get a question about the percentage of people that chose not to answer the poll results. And so apologies for not providing that information in real time, but generally about 40% of the participants were answering the polls. So there were about, oh, Elisa's shaking her head. Did I get that backwards?
Yeah, the other way around.
Okay, so 60% were answering, and we had about 40% not participating in the polls. Let's see. I'm looking to see if there are any other questions. I think we have, oh, here's one. Has the effect of upland drainage into the estuaries been looked at and in terms of the influence of the high nitrate levels? Fred, I think that one's to you again.
Yeah, and so when we did our watershed analyses, we did see that the source of nitrogen and phosphorus. Now, I do a lot of work with freshwater lakes, and there we focus very heavily on phosphorus. In these marine and estuarine areas, it's really nitrogen that drives a lot of that productivity. We did look in a variety of sources. So a lot of it was surface runoff, stormwater, septic systems, as well as waterfowl, pet waste, maybe some small collection of livestock or horses. But there was a variety of sources. And I know a lot of the green infrastructure that you'll be talking about really helps to remove those nutrients. Some of the things we do want to mention, like Amy mentioned, a lot of the existing infrastructure is really important to maintain, because if you can keep those maintained and remove those solids before they end up going into the ponds, that it's a lot cheaper in the long run to maintain those structures than let the ponds fill in and then do something very expensive like dredging. So if you can maintain those existing catch basins, incorporate green infrastructure as much as possible to remove as much of the nutrients, septic management and maintenance can go a long way. So, as part of the report, we have identified those watershed sources.
Okay, great. Elisa, I can't see if somebody raised their hand. Do we have any other? No. Okay. I believe we have addressed the questions that we've received. So I think that we can end the webinar and the public meeting, and hope that you all will join us again next week for the second part of this two-part presentation. So thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Take care.